Hey everybody, it's Norm from Tested.
It's Jeremy from Tested.
Welcome to Projections, our show about virtual reality, augmented reality, all things mixed reality, and this is our last episode of the year.
The year we launched Projections.
I know, like 36 episodes, 35 episodes in.
That's been good.
It's been, and we're planning on doing many more, but we thought it'd be a good time to recap the state of VR and give some shout outs to some of our favorite games and experiences over the past not only year, but 2 years, because a lot of more people are using VR now
Hopefully
than a year ago.
a lot of people got headsets for the holidays. Maybe they're brand new to the space and they're like, well, what should I play? Because now there's so many options. A year ago, there weren't. Like a year ago, it was like everything. Please just give me a new title and we'd play it and it'd be wonderful. Now it's copious. We have a cornucopia of games to play and we thought we would help you narrow them down.
Yeah, and some of these games are actually games that came out in the early days of VR because they're still some of our favorites.
Yeah.
And some are commendable for the things they did in VR and the ways they experimented and made VR unique. So I think we would be remiss not to shout out our favorite overall VR game and experience of the year, which I think is the same for both of us. It's Lone Echo.
And Echo Arena.
And Echo Arena, yeah.
They're kind of almost the same thing. Echo Arena is now, first of all, they're both Oculus Studios titles, so these are available on the Oculus Store. As with all of the things on the Oculus Store, there are ways to play them on the Vive and vice versa. Just Google it, that's your friend if you're new to either of these platforms. But for me, Echo Arena and Lone Echo, they fulfilled the promise of VR greater than any other title. Yeah. What we're calling the locomotion mechanic, the way that you move around the space, is just far and away better than any other title that I've played. It is a natural thing. Now, it's a zero-G environment, so they had that going for it, but I think it's probably designed for VR for that reason, because it just feels right. You're grabbing the space, and one-to-one, you're moving your body, and then you propel yourself, and you let go, and you float until you go across the room, and you grab something else, and then you are again one-to-one, and your hand is so well animated in that space, anything that you grab, it actually wraps around. Interestingly, your fingers go places your actual fingers aren't, but it just feels right. There's just a lot about that game, and I'm speaking just the locomotion in Echo Arena, where you're 3v3 in a disc game trying to get your disc through the other goal. That is just immersing, and you lose yourself. You lose yourself. It fulfills that promise. It's like the interface to the game, the way that your hands move and your body moves, it just feels right. It's not confusing. You're not wrestling the controls. It just feels right.
The intuition and the comfort that they accomplished by solving this big problem allowed them to be bold in taking risks with Echo Arena, with how challenging that game could be. If the locomotion mechanic, grabbing things, flying around in zero-G wasn't comfortable, the game would not be as competitive or as fun or as challenging. Right. It'd be much simpler. We've seen many examples of sports games in VR that don't have locomotion solved, that don't have the depth of Echo Arena. Same with the single player. Because they got that solved, they were able to make a really high quality, AAA, compelling sci-fi short story in VR.
Very slow paced, which maybe in a 2D experience might have been a criticism, but it's not a criticism in VR. It's just fun to be in a world in which you are that immersed. And again, I feel like the interface that they figured out, a lot of VR titles, they come out and maybe they're remakes of PC games where they are trying to work a keyboard into your VR controller or some other reason. There's a learning process. I felt with Lone Echo and Echo Arena, they just nailed it, almost to an unfair degree. And I would like to see other games adopt this locomotion, the things that we learned from Echo Arena. And I will not criticize you for being a copycat. I think that there's something to be learned here.
Some of the simplest mechanics, some of the most compelling, and that grabbing and climbing mechanic was one of our favorites of the year. I think probably the locomotion mechanic of the year, if we're going to give an award for that. And there are two other experiences that use that. One is called, well, Climby.
Right. Yeah, Climby was actually first to the table with this, and you introduced this to me. Climby is one of these free titles that has a level making mechanic, and it's multiplayer, and it's very low budget. Like, you look at it and you just think, oh, that looks like a Unity the engine. Like, it doesn't even maybe look textured. But it's wonderful because, like everything else we experience in VR, it doesn't have to look incredible. The fidelity doesn't have to be amazing. You just feel like you're in that world regardless. And they get this really interesting jumping mechanic with climbing, where you're swinging your arms, and there's a physics engine that you come to grips with, and you're climbing on walls, and you're grabbing walls that are grabbable, and you're sliding off ones that aren't, and you're traversing what is essentially climbing puzzles.
Yep.
And I got to tell you, of all the games this year that people have come to my house and played, this is the one that I think has gotten the most love.
Yeah, because you understand the natural fear of heights that people have, right? And so it takes advantage of that, and it does a thing that on paper should not sound right. Your feet are planted on the ground, but in space, you're hanging in the air, and you don't care.
Right.
That disconnect is not bother you. You still have the fear of don't want to let go, of grabbing the next thing, vaulting over to the next thing. And that's something that not only Climbing did, but also the Climb did as well in introducing motion controls.
First it came out on gamepad, and it was a good game. They did a very interesting thing with gamepad, but it was clearly destined for touch controls, and it became even better, I think. This strange feeling of moving your body one-to-one, and you do things as you would in Echo-Arena or the Climbing that would be physically impossible if you shake your hand really fast. But the fact that you do remain one-to-one keeps you grounded in the space. It doesn't make you sick. So many of these titles are like how to deal with motion sickness. And these are games that have figured it out.
And with the Climb being developed by Crytek and having this beautiful world, really takes advantage of all that processing power you have on your gaming PC.
It is the fidelity opposite of Climbing. It is a beautiful game.
And that just helps with, combined with the mechanic, really helps with immersion. And really good job for them putting in the motion controls, even though the game originally did not have motion controls. It's actually quite an old game in the world of VR.
If we're talking about games that really have nailed the interface, I don't see how you can forget Job Simulator. It is continually a game I go back to when people come over and try VR for the first time that is just clearly, they figured out VR from the ground up. It is not a converted title. It is a ground up made for VR. And what they figured out was VR is not Lego, it's Duplo. And you have all of the pieces that are just gigantic and big knobs and big things that you combine, and you feel like a child when you enter this environment. And you can mix things together. There's an assortment of Easter eggs you can discover. And it's just fun to explore that world and be challenged by the puzzles, but really just have fun in this sandbox. That is really well designed too, because there are different size rooms based on how much space you have in your play space.
Yeah, and your brain has no problem with turning the dial on a Duplo oven versus the frustration of seeing a real scale oven dial and not being able to do that, right? And they took those lessons, developers of Job Simulator, Alchemy Labs, to their second game, Rick and Morty Virtual Reality, which basically is a skin version of Job Simulator with a story, but took a lot of those lessons and making these systems interactive and as a narrative fun game with the humor of the TV show. I think it was a huge success in not just being a tie-in, but being a standalone fun interactive VR game.
Yeah, absolutely. So a brand new game, probably the newest game on the list that we give props to is LA Noir VR Case Files. I felt so immersed in this game from a story standpoint. I just loved the feeling of feeling like I was a police officer in the 1940s, which is not something I've ever desired to be. But I haven't enjoyed a story like that since playing adventure games, you know, in the 80s and early 90s, which that I've had no interest in the longest time. But I feel like VR could offer the reinvention of the adventure game in a very compelling way.
And I think it was really smart of, you know, we talked about this last week, of Rockstar to look at their titles and pick the one that made sense in VR. And it wasn't about capturing, what is it about capturing the LA Noir game, right? You know, interrogating people, interviewing witnesses, solving mysteries by collecting evidence. What about that made that work in VR? They connected the dots. Whereas, you know, we talked about when we reviewed Doom VFR, a game that on paper sounded like it, of course, was made for VR. They didn't necessarily get all the mechanics adapted properly to make it as fun as I thought it could be in my head.
Right, no, exactly. LA Noir was, I think, the execution of converting this old game was exceptionally well done. There's other games like Skyrim and Fallout, which, while excellent games in their own right, they are the PC game, and the interfaces have been crammed into VR controllers. I feel like they knew what VR did well with LA Noir, and they converted it expertly.
I hope that this gives developers and publishers a chance to look back at their portfolios and see and really evaluate, rather than spend tens of millions of dollars having to create all the assets again, to make a VR game from scratch. Pick the right ones, pick the ones that maybe the mechanics can feel the most intuitive, or where VR can bring something to the table, and then adapt those games in VR. Maybe a Star Wars game. That would be pretty cool. And you mentioned Doom, it's a shooter, and there are a lot of shooters. I think a lot of more shooters this year than any other big budget title. And one of the ones that we had the most fun with was Robo Recall.
Well, Robo Recall is a free game on the Oculus Rift, so it had that going for it. But I absolutely think it is an expertly done game. It uses the teleportation mechanic in a way that is maybe a case study for the way to do it. You teleport from one spot to another, and when you do, it slows down in the bullet time. In fact, a lot of the shooters this year use a bullet time mechanic, which is interesting for VR because it feels much more immersive, but it's also a way to deal with that fast-paced kinetic energy that a shooter brings to it. But the Robo Recall, the fact that you can rip arms off, that is not something you're doing in a standard shooter. The fact that you teleport over somebody and then you grab them and throw them and it becomes a visceral, actual physical engagement rather than a simple point and shoot shooter, that's what made Robo Recall work so well for me.
And fast paced, too. And another shooter that actually was slow paced, but did the same thing in that, shooters, you think of long distance encounters, the best shooters we found actually were close, near-field encounters. And on the slow side, you had Super Hot VR, a game played entirely in bullet time, where the physicality of your body being tracked and your hands being tracked made that shooter a puzzle game, and to me, one of the most innovative VR experiences to date.
Well, if we're going to talk about the classics, I would have to say Space Pirate Trainer. I keep bringing that up every time VR comes up as the Galaga of VR. I still think it is the arcade version of the VR classic. And it improved substantially when they released the 1.0 version just actually a few months ago, after being out in what I guess was a beta form for several months, if not a year. And it adds motherships and a better progression. And it's really well tailored. There's a lot of fit and finish to the game. There's a nice party mode, so if you have friends over, you just put it on this mode. Anyone can put the headset on and just start playing immediately. It is a standing in place. It's not a room scale game, but it is terribly immersing and just a blast to play.
And a lot of the times when we describe VR games, we have to use analogies to games that from our classic arcade games, the first of those genres, or PC games, flat screen games, and console games. One game that I loved in VR this year, I don't think has a perfect analogy in any platform, and that's the Invisible Hours, an immersive theater experience where you're spending 2 hours following along as a ghost in a story, like not a literal ghost, but a non-interactive character in a story, and watching basically performance capture unfold, a story unfold before your eyes.
Yeah, this is the game that's interesting because you can control that rate too. You do have God abilities, but you are not involved in that world. You don't engage with anything. No. You don't have physical capability in that world at all. You're not affecting the other players. You are an observer, and you feel like a ghost almost in this space. It's not what you consider. Let's make a VR game out of, but it works well, doesn't it?
It works so well, and it lets performance really intimate performance really shine in VR, where I could be watching it on a screen, a video of someone acting this out, or I could be watching a cutscene on a monitor for a console game. But the fact that I'm standing next to the character, seeing them yell at another character, and seeing that character cry or lash back out, feeling like I'm in their physical space, that's something that only VR can bring. And then writing a story that has multiple perspective, it's a classic, classic telltale tale of like everyone has a different version of their story. Being able to use that replayability as a mechanic to find the truth in the story, I thought was just brilliant.
With the Oculus Story Studios now shut down, we did at least get a few stories out of them before they did, and they were all experimenting with narrative as well. Exactly. And I think narrative in VR has tons more potential, more potential than standard 2D games ever did.
Yeah, well, there are also plenty of games that don't need narrative at all, puzzle games specifically. And one of the ones that first debuted on PSVR and now is on Steam VR is Super Hypercube.
You love this game.
I would call it, to use an analogy, the Tetris of VR.
Okay.
And this is a game, it's that Fox TV show Hole in the Wall where you got to get the shape, rotate it, and have it sent through and hit the silhouette. And the fact that you could technically, I guess, play this on a handheld or on a console, but the fact that you can see the shape, the three-dimensional shape in front of you and look around it and have that tunnel vision of being focused just on this one problem, it was the closest I could imagine to like those Star Trek Next Generation games that Data would play.
And you think this could really only work best in VR? This is not a game that could be converted to 2D and it only maybe looks better. It wouldn't be
the same experience. I think the fact that you have to look around, like the physicality of your head being the camera, is something that I think is important to this game.
Well, combining puzzle games with what we were talking about a moment ago, adventure games, there is the Gallery. Now, the Gallery, the first episode came out ages ago. It was one of the first Kickstarters when the Oculus Rift was still in developer kit status. But the episode 2 came out this year, and it's just great. Like, they really have figured out VR puzzles. There's a lot of mechanics that almost make you feel like you're at a carnival, playing games that require some finesse and fidelity, and you're moving things, and things envelop you in your hands. And they have experimented in that space from a puzzle standpoint and from a sort of an adventure standpoint, I think better than any of the other guys.
Yeah, really taking advantage of that pixel precision.
Yeah.
A lot of games, and you have it in a shooting game, it is still pixel precision, lining up the sights, but here it's slow-paced, thoughtful, methodical, and great production values all around. I think it's definitely worth checking out. Yeah. Now, one of the best things in VR isn't just solving these puzzles by yourself or doing any activity by yourself. We've said, and we've been big proponents of social in VR, and I think no experience gets that lockdown better than Rec Room.
Isn't that funny? The free game.
Yeah.
Like the free game figured it out, and maybe that's no coincidence because there's always people in there. It's going to be social experience no matter what, and honestly, social experiences that are public aren't always the greatest. Like if I go into Echo Arena these days, it's a crapshoot. You're not sure what other people are going to be in there. Maybe there's going to be a bunch of 7-year-olds that are just like futzing around.
They shouldn't be in the game.
Who can say? But in Rec Room, there's some weird stuff happening, but it is definitely social and a brand new thing. However, it's on my list for if you go in there with a group of friends. Because if you go into Rec Room and don't hang out in the lobby, just dive into one of the quests. The quests, whether the space one or the medieval one or even the new laser tag, it is a blast. I mean, it is like best game of the year level enjoyment that you can have. The graphics aren't phenomenal. But they embrace that. They make it look like a high school production of some drama department, and it's just they understand VR and they understand pacing and how difficult enemies should be and how I should engage with those enemies, and they're doing great work.
They really simplified again. Once you get mechanics comfortable and simple, so you're not worried about fiddling with that.
Yeah.
Then you let the parts of VR that can shine really shine.
Yeah.
And in that case, it's just feeling like you're in the same room as 3 of your friends.
Exactly. And
letting the conversations flow naturally, and you're literally just hanging out with a purpose.
It's what I wanted so badly from Star Trek Bridge Crew, and which Bridge Crew delivered for the first 20 minutes, but then you feel strapped to your controls and maybe the missions are too repetitive. But Bridge Crew is one of those games that was so close this year to being phenomenal, but it just didn't quite work for me.
And Bridge Crew, you're controlling a spaceship, and also one of the oldest VR experiences. I think they've still been improving over the years. If you want to feel like you're in command of a spaceship, you can't go wrong if you try Elite Dangerous. This is, you can spend hours and hours. It's a simulator.
This is our first favorite game.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
I mean, this is totally. It's proved that cockpit games were comfortable in VR. Yeah. We had it with the DK2, and now that we have higher fidelity headsets, and now that you have great, track controllers, and even if you play this with a HOTAS controller, they've added more content and content and content. This is a game where you can really feel like the world is real and that the universe that you believe in is real because you can fly anywhere.
Right.
You can interact with giant space stations. You can upgrade your ship. It really feels like there's like another dimension that you're being teleported to.
Totally.
Now, wearing the headset in that world may be a little straining because there's a lot of just doing nothing sometimes. And so there's some features that we want to give a shout out to, especially Oculus Core 2.0, that make experiences like Elite Dangerous even better.
I can see how features like Core 2.0 will extend to Vive probably in the near future. It's just too good. It's the ability to bring your desktop and the web and anything that exists on that, which is music or movies or webcam streams, into your VR space. It's a way to incorporate your standard desktop features into your VR space. And even Core 2.0 doesn't nail it. Like, I want it to be in my space. I want it to be nailed onto components in my VR space, no matter what game it is. And of course, these are wish list items. But I think that's going to be a big trend next year that we're looking forward to, is how do we blend the worlds? Not just real world to VR, but also possibly VR worlds. You know, I want to be able to make something in medium and just drag and drop it into another VR space, maybe my home in one of the the core environments.
You're talking about the mixing of realities, which makes a lot of sense for mixed reality systems that these all are. So those are just some of our favorite VR experiences from the past year, 2 years of using VR. Of course, there are plenty more experiences out there, some of which we haven't had a chance to really dive into. A whole world of PSVR games and a lot of games coming out next year as well. We'd love to hear from you what some of your favorite games and experiences and notable moments in VR were. Just post in the comments below, especially for new people who are just jumping into VR. And before we wrap up, we also have a special feature. We were able to visit Pixar Animation Studios. Filmmakers of some of our favorite
films. They know
films.
who Pixar is.
Yes, of course. They recently collaborated with a company to make Coco VR, which was a promotional VR experience for their latest film. And so we've been curious what Pixar thinks about VR and storytelling in VR. And so we chatted with the producer of Coco VR about his thoughts on that. So Mark, thank you so much for having us here. We really love Coco the film. We thought Coco VR was such an interesting experience. Could you start off by just telling us how this idea came about to do a VR experience in the world of Coco?
Sure. Pixar had been kicking the tires about virtual reality for a number of years, or a couple of years anyway, and we were looking for kind of different projects. We had thought potentially we would do something narrative, but we've always felt like if the right entry into virtual reality would be in support of one of our feature films. And I think the confluence of timing, kind of a little bit of maturity in the industry, Coco, the film itself, is such a spectacular movie with amazing visuals and a world, the land of the dead, that just lent itself to experiencing it in a headset and seeing that in a headset. And then kind of the partnership with Oculus, really. So those three things all kind of came together, and that's where the idea or the timing and the project came from.
You worked with a development house called Magnopus in LA they did the engineering on it.
Correct.
Can you talk about what your process is like with them? I would assume that Pixar retains all control and that they get direction from you. Do you have a concept when you come to them, or is it?
You know, how does that work? Because they had a lot more experience than we did in virtual reality. Mm-hmm. It was really a good collaboration, frankly, with them, as far as kind of giving us some guardrails to watch out for, or things to think about as we're developing the creative. And then obviously they're part of the overall deal, so we needed to make sure that our appetite matched with what the feasibility was, given the project scope. So we worked with them on we would generate the assets and then ship them off down south to LA via the cloud, and they would kind of put together a build and that we would review in the headset with them, and do a joint scout with them, and then walk through kind of the experience and talk about how we wanted to continue to shape it from there.
Were most of the assets they used for the title originally made for film and then converted for VR?
Yeah.
Okay.
They were almost 100%. And in a lot of cases, we repackaged assets from the film. So like the VR experience takes place in kind of a big plaza, the heart of it. And that plaza exists in the film, but the offshoots and the branches from that plaza, we stuck things together onto that. So like Ceci's costume shop is up a stairwell from the plaza in VR, but that does not, in the feature or the real asset, that's not how it exists.
Right. So I imagine you think of these as complementary experiences, not just as a promotional tool. It brings awareness to the film, but like putting on the headset and watching a film are fundamentally different types of immersive experiences. One, you're following a story, and one, you're in the world. Like, what did you guys do to make sure that it felt like that world was right for VR, and what did you want to get the viewer, the person using the VR headset, to get out of that?
You know, we did want to pique their interest in the movie. It was a big part of it, frankly, was to show them how spectacular and well thought through and detailed this world was, and it's an imaginary place, and so to allow people to experience it up close in 3 dimensions was something that we wanted to really give viewers that opportunity and hopefully interest them in the movie. But as you say, there are certain things that might be very interesting in the film in 2 dimensions on a screen that might not play as well or be too complicated for us to deal with in virtual reality. So we're always kind of balancing real-time rendering, what is possible and what might look good, versus giving viewers a real exposure and experience.
I would say even the other way around also, because in VR you get so much out of just being in an environment, lingering there as long as you want. You get to absorb so much of those assets. Do some of the artists here who worked on the film put on the headset and see the content differently?
Well, so there's 2 different answers to that question. Like, I think on Coco, and for Coco VR, we worked pretty closely with a production designer, Harley Jessup, to talk about different locations and what might be interesting to see, and that was really fun to kind of put him in the headset, and he got a chance to see these environments that he had designed or sketched and had been staring at for several years in many cases and on a screen. And for him to put on the headset was really exhilarating, actually, to watch, and he was just effusive in his amazement and praise of it. And the other piece of that is we're actually using that kind of technique in that the idea of getting the filmmakers in the headset, experiencing their environments in such a way that you really get a sense of scale. You get ideas for new cameras. There are a lot of things that you can see in VR in a headset that you just don't get staring at somebody's computer monitor or at a screen.
So as a part of the film production process.
Yeah, so our future films are playing around with that, I'd say, in terms of like their environment, scouting and modeling and contemplating camera angles and where they might find cool shots.
Do you guys see the VR production, at least what you've done with Coco, any differently than you've seen some of the video games that Pixar has been involved in producing? I mean, is it more or less the same where you're coming up with a concept or collaborating on a concept and then providing assets to another company? Or do you see VR as something that's taking a different path from video games?
It's an interesting question. I'm not familiar enough with what the overall kind of game plan was and why we made certain choices in the video game area. I think there are certain advantages to trying a lot of things in-house, but working with Magnopus as an example, like they are experts in what's possible, the state of the industry, the state of the the development kits, and where social was going with Oculus as an example, and matchmaking in the Oculus system. All that kind of stuff is not really core to what our business is. Our business is telling stories.
That's why I asked, because there have been some experiments in VR, from Oculus Studios, for instance, a company that used to be internal to Oculus, where they developed stories where you would sit down and you would engage. It was almost like you were watching a production, live. But there can be interactive elements. Things might wait for you to look at them before they engage you or something like that. And it seems to me like there's that kind of storytelling potential in VR still. And I wonder if Pixar, has any interest in that. If there's people here who would like to maybe tell something original in VR, for instance, or more than a tie-in with a movie as a promotion, but maybe just something a little deeper than that. Is that something that interests you?
I think there's. I think my hunch is that Pixar will go where the creative takes them, and so if there's a great idea that is a great story that should be told in virtual reality, then I don't think we would necessarily shy away from it just because it's virtual reality. But that's certainly not our objective.
Right.
Our core business is telling movies on a screen, reaching large audiences and family audiences, and telling great stories. And be that in a short film, be that in a feature-length film, in the future, be it in a headset, I wouldn't say no, but it's not.
Niche audience.
Yeah, it's a niche audience right now.
Yeah. You talk about the production pipeline, how it's really the assets that were used in the film that were grafted onto the VR experience. Going forward, is that the idea to make assets, or is that something that Pixar has always been doing in making the assets versatile that can be used in different formats and different mediums?
To be careful here. We make our assets for the film, really, and in fact, because we use proprietary software, our assets don't necessarily ship outside to the outside world and to other packages very easily, to be perfectly honest. And so that we design them to render our films, and that is the objective with them. Real-time rendering is something that is out there in the industry now, and so the more that we can play around in that, I think only benefits us in terms of speed and being able to tell our stories, make our movies faster. But I don't know that that's necessarily an objective for us.
It's what you made 20 years ago could probably be rendered in real time now, right? I mean,
quite possibly.
At least to the human eye. I mean, maybe not with the amount of full fidelity, but it would be interesting, to see some of the older material maybe updated for real time, just to see what would happen.
Yeah, well, I think we're making our next two films are sequels, Incredibles and Toy Story, and so we might get a chance to play around with that in the future.
One of the things that we've discovered about VR is not only the immersion, but how much you can do animation with it too. Like you're tracking your head, you're tracking your hands, and with the Oculus controllers, other things, other cues like where your fingers are. And even in Coco, you're looking in a mirror and you become a character.
Yeah.
Is that something you find can be beneficial to the prototyping animation processes, creating test animations? Is that a tool that the artists here are considering using?
I don't know that they are, frankly. I think, we're playing around with motion capture, but that's different than what you're talking about, although related. So to my knowledge, we're not doing that, but I know it is people have a lot of fun seeing their avatars move around and dance around in the world.
It's one of the most compelling things I think about the experience is that you become a character from the film in that world, and that's why I assume that's why you made it social as well, so you're seeing other people who are also then the characters.
That was the hook, frankly, for Coco VR from the very beginning. There was a woman down at Disney, Alice Taylor, who, when we first started talking about doing Coco and the project, she was just like, dancing skeletons. Everybody's gonna love being a dancing skeleton and seeing themselves dancing as a skeleton or as a character from the film. And it's true. It was fun to watch people get in the headset and see themselves in the mirror and dancing around as a Skeletor.
Did you experiment, or did you consider making a VR promotion using any of the earlier films, even Toy Story, Cars 3 from earlier this year?
We contemplated Cars 3, is the honest truth. And that was partly driven by some requests down at Disney, or some ideas that came from there. But we felt like Coco really was the right timing for us, as well as the right material. Like that imaginary world was so fantastic.
It is a good word, yeah.
And I can see some of our future films also lending themselves quite well to something in virtual reality or a promotional piece, so to say.
Because at some point, if you let the user become a character, you lose control of how that character is represented.
Storytellers have a hard time with that.
Yeah,
that's right. Well, storytellers have a hard time with virtual reality. Frankly, you know, it goes a little bit against kind of what you're taught and what you learn in terms of directing the eye and where you want people to look and choosing your cameras. And in this case, you can go anywhere and look at anything. And that was one of the more interesting things for me. Is we spent a lot of time on the little bit of animation that is in there. We animated in-house first, and we spent quite a bit of effort on that. And you know, Pixar quality animation is a pretty high bar, and you watch people in the headset and watch people in that final scene on stage with Hector, and people are moving doing the shakers and checking out the band and throwing shakers at each other, and not watching Hector necessarily. Yeah, and so it's which is fine, but it's also like, oh, okay, it's a lesson learned. How do you direct their eye to look there, or do you want them? Do you not? Where do you want to spend your dollars?
Right. It seems like it's more of a live performance, like it's a stage performance.
Exactly.
You can't control what they're looking at.
That's right.
And, yeah, that's interesting. But that also means it lends itself to replayability in a new way, where you go back and you can experience something entirely different.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Do you imagine it might change the way you think about telling a story, that you're creating story and worlds hand in hand, but you have to pay as much attention to the world as also the characters in the story?
Yeah, you have to. I mean, we pay a lot of attention to the worlds that we create in our films. The details are so richly thought through, and I hope that shows in being able to go explore in Coco VR. I mean, it's a lot of beautiful detail in there. But like you're saying, I think that just that in and of itself is part of the experience. Right, and the more you can actually interact with that world and the set pieces and the environments, I think the more engaging it'll be for audience members.
Do you feel like the power of computers right now is up to what you would like to do in VR, or is it just the beginning?
I think it's headed there.
Okay,
for sure. I mean, you know, crowd scenes are really hard to portray in VR. And frankly, some of the detail and some of the animation, you know, it's the divide of game engine versus feature film.
Right.
We see that playing out a bit, but it's catching up quickly, obviously, and it's exciting. I have no doubt that you know, we're still scratching the surface of what this industry can be, both for storytelling, for promotional pieces, for many, many things.
You've been at Pixar for a long time now, so you've seen the animation industry change. Do you get that vibe a little bit from VR? Like there's a path forward?
Yeah, what do they call that? There's like all the excitement building up, and then the reality hits in. There's the trough of disappointment, and I think we might be kind of, frankly, in that a little bit. But I also think that that's just setting the stage for kind of what comes next, really, because you know, in my mind, there's no question that this has a place as a supporting promotional pieces for films, for example. It has a place for education. It has a place in storytelling. It's just trying to figure out the right way to tell those stories. It's a theme park ride, and you're that you can experience in your living room, you know, on your couch, or frankly, or standing up in front of your computer, and that's exciting, you know, and that a lot of great creative minds, I'm sure, are going to start like chipping away at what to do in that space.
Now, we come from an old PC gaming background, and it seems like PC games had reached a real apex where it's just the graphical fidelity is unreal now, and you can do so much, almost anything that you want to do. Whereas VR has rebooted that, and it's now we're back to low res again, you know, and we're back to like system requirements, and the requirement is a high-end system.
Yep.
And that's exciting because, you know, you're at the beginning of something again.
Yeah.
And the possibilities are now just being discovered. And I know we would love to see, as much as we love Pixar as a movie studio, that we'd love to see that imagination applied to this new medium so much.
Yeah, and I think as the, you know, fidelity improves, as the technology improves, it'll open up new doors to being able to tell new story, or tell stories in different ways. That is exciting. I have no doubt about it. And this is coming from somebody who, you know, I prior to Coco VR and playing around with that and prototyping that, I had barely put on a headset. So I'm brand new to this medium, but I see a lot of possibilities with it for sure.
Awesome. We can't wait. We can't wait to see what you guys come up with next.
Can't wait to work on it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I thought that was interesting. It was clear to me after chatting with them that, you know, Pixar is in the business of making movies.
No, this was a promotional piece that they made. This is not their Piper of VR, you know, in VR, or any of the other shorts that they've made that are brilliant. And what I desperately want is for that creativity to be applied to something original. And I guess maybe that came out in some of my questions. But it is my hope that Pixar will see VR as a medium for storytelling, just as much as Oculus Story Studios did, or some of the other artists that we see out there.
And they are using VR as a tool. Right, they're using it to experiment with scale and to previs some of their graphic environments. Maybe they're not using it for animation, but you know, they told us after the fact that he wished he could have used VR for Piper, which he produced.
Yeah, exactly. That was the short that aired in front of, was it Cars 3, where it was a small bird on a beach, and it, you know, it found bugs under the water thanks to a crab, and it's a wonderful story. But he said they had such trouble with scale in that movie, and having VR as a tool would have helped them tremendously. And he, in fact, said that they are using it on other titles, converting some of their assets into a game engine, and you know, viewing it from inside.
And VR is a collaboration tool on developing other projects. You know, they have their hands, Disney has its hands in so many things like theme parks and some of the rides, for example. You know, VR makes a lot of sense, not only in the rides, but the way to previs what the experience is like.
He said that they actually prevised the entire Finding Nemo submarine ride in Disneyland using VR, such that you were actually in a virtual submarine riding the ride. And they said that was the best way to convey what you would see. Because have you ridden that ride recently?
Yeah.
You look out the window and you see characters out there, but I could imagine developing that might be a challenge because you're not sure what people can see through a submarine window. VR is perfect for that.
Yeah, so VR definitely has its legs in content creation, but we want to see story.
Please.
And so we're crossing our fingers, and hopefully Pixar will surprise us in the future with something.
Especially Pixar, man. They're the Ed Catmull is the god of computer graphics. I mean, I would love to see his genius and the genius of the storytellers applied to VR.
Well, thanks for watching our show this year. We'll be back next year with more episodes, more deep dives. We have a whole world of AR coming out next year.
Oh my.
And one thing I do want to mention is that if you have big screen VR, which is also free, and you're going to be online on December 29th and 30th, they're doing a movie screening in VR. They're going to watch Top Gun 3D.
Highway to the Danger Zone.
With thousands of people, and we'll be watching as well, so hopefully we'll see you there. But until then, see you on the internet.
Happy New Year.
Bye.